Hi everyone and welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description.
Lord of Mystery, Lucky by author Nan Haiyu Xing Chen. Chapter 701-710. Chapter 701 Chapter 93 Grisha, the Lonely Old Father. Alice was confused, because the only way she could think of to influence Ouroboros was probably through influence from the top of the pathway, but this method of influence did not require Ouroboros to stay by her side. It couldn't be that she wanted Ouroboros to be so angered by her that he developed humanity, could it? Her questioning gaze did not elicit an abnormal reaction from Grisha Adam. He merely glanced at Alice, then spoke. I don't know. This was Ouroboros' own request. Quote. Alice showed a look of horror. If you say that, I'm even more afraid to take him. He couldn't have received another guidance from fate, could he? Indeed, Grisha Adam nodded. That's why I said, you can refuse. Alice shivered. Frankly, if one excluded the fact that Ouroboros did not believe in her, he would definitely be an excellent candidate for Pope. He was an angel of her own pathway, had rich experience as Pope, had independently established and led a large religious organization, and everyone in that organization was a fanatical believer. But the problem was that Ouroboros didn't believe in her at all. Alice didn't know whether Ouroboros prioritized his lord or fate in his heart, but she was certain that there was absolutely no place for her in it, unless Ouroboros regarded her as the embodiment of fate. In fact, she really was the embodiment of fate, at least in some sense. After all, even the fool could become a god by fooling her. Thinking of this, Alice's expression turned a bit fierce, and she replied. Let him come, but I might not always. Since I'm going to establish a church, I will definitely collect beyonder characteristics of my pathway and cultivate my own beyonders, which will always be more reliable than those who join halfway. Quote. Perhaps not. Grisha Adams said with an inexplicable expression, it seems no one has told you that Storm, Pure White, and Fate, all three of them followed me from their weakest stages. Quote. Alice opened her mouth in surprise. Two of the three ran away. Now the last one is also telling you he wants to run, this. With such blatant sarcasm, Alice even nervously switched to an honorific, but Grisha Adam didn't seem to mind, only confirming. Have you decided? If you have decided, I will relay your response to Ouroboros, and he should come to see you very soon. Alice twitched her lips. She looked at Grisha Adam, inexplicably feeling a strange sense of seeing a lonely elder. How nice, a father is like this, even if you leave home and don't come back to see him for years, he still worries about you. Grisha Adam's expression changed, and he promptly stopped Alice's diverging thoughts. I think, those three should not be considered my children. Alice coughed twice, then couldn't help but say. But, God Almighty, the Creator, aren't these titles equivalent to Heavenly Father? No, wait a minute, I call Klein Mother, if you are Heavenly Father, I call you Father, then. She looked up, gazing at the golden-bearded father. Father lowered his head, his expression gentle and unruffled. He spoke in the mildest possible tone. I will send you back to your mother. Quote. Alice swallowed twice in horror. But Grisha Adam didn't seem to have any intention of complaining. Alice was still safely handed over to Klein, placed in the crib, and then he asked Klein, who was beside him. Mysteries. How did you first think of fooling fate in that way? Alice covered her mouth, coughing violently. Grisha Adam was still looking at Klein. Klein was stunned by the question, his expression became strange, and he turned to look at Alice, then asked as if in casual conversation. Haven't you asked Eamon? Eamon knows too. Grisha Adam also turned to look at Alice. How to put it? Klein's expression was a bit odd. What I know is more complete and detailed, but Eamon saw the scene directly. Scene. Grisha Adam repeated, glanced at Alice, and his brow twitched. Is it, a scene like this? Klein blinked, and a woman with long golden hair suddenly appeared before his eyes. Her golden hair was as dazzling as sunlight, shimmering and cascading down to her waist. Her eyes were black, and her expression was gentle and loving, reminding Klein of the Madonna statues in his memory. The golden-haired woman in the painting wore a white robe, her figure faintly visible beneath the loose garment, barefoot, with a silver cross pendant that Klein recognized hanging on her chest. Her hands were clasped over her chest, and she looked down at him with lowered eyes. Klein stared blankly at the face, and after a few breaths, he suddenly turned and glared at Alice. At this moment, Alice was covering her mouth with her hand, desperately shrinking into the corner of the wall. "Who is this?" Klein asked her calmly. Alice's expression twisted for a moment, then she firmly covered her mouth with her right hand and pointed at Grisha Adam with her left. Klein turned to look at Grisha Adam again, who, as the perspective, God Almighty, spoke calmly, "This is her imagined version of me from the demoness pathway." Klein wanted to curse, but words were so powerless at this moment that he couldn't find a suitable word to describe his feelings. "I don't know," Klein explained, "I haven't seen it, but yours is a realistic painting style. What Eamon saw should be a comic." Grisha Adam turned to look at Alice again. Alice silently lowered her hand and explained, I want to declare first, this really has nothing to do with me. I don't know what it counts as, but that story was a prophecy left to me by the former Key of Light. He told me that Eamon and Klein would be together and would have a beautiful love story. Some of those scenes, some I drew, some she gave me as reference pictures, so. This really has nothing to do with me." Grisha Adam nodded calmly. He seemed to accept the explanation and turned to Klein, saying, "I will come to her again after a while to ask her to help me confirm some things." Klein nodded and said yes, then added, "By the way, I found that I seem to be able to contact people from the West Continent through the barrier. I will try to communicate with them soon." Grisha Adam nodded, and Klein continued, "You should know that the situations of Saphira Castle and Chaos Sea are different. Besides me, Rosal, and Evernight, who have already descended, there are many others. I plan to bring them down." "Really?" Alice exclaimed excitedly, "I want to recruit them to my religion." This interrupted their conversation. Grisha Adam glanced at Alice indifferently, then nodded to Klein and said, "Given the current situation, it is indeed possible to do so. However, your most urgent task right now is to have a good talk with her. Otherwise, you might one day see prophecies about the two of us." After he finished speaking, he simply disappeared, under Alice's horrified gaze and Klein's stunned expression. Klein slowly raised his hand, turned his head towards Alice, and asked in a tone devoid of emotion, "Explain." I didn't say anything. Alice emphasized, it's like this, you see, you are my mother, he is the Creator, the Heavenly Father, and can also be considered my father, so. Klein's eyelids twitched, and he shouted with a tremor in his voice, "Alice." Alice closed her mouth, hugged her head, and curled into a ball. Klein gritted his teeth. It took him some time to calm down, and he said through clenched teeth, Never mind, it's not the first day I've known you, I should have known what kind of person you are. What else did you talk about?" Alice coughed lightly, then first waved her hand, and with a rustling sound, gems cascaded across the floor like a waterfall, making the room sparkle. Klein stared at the pile of gems on the ground, his expression dazed. This is for the Abraham family," Alice said indifferently, "this is yours, Mr. Fool." Alice grabbed 2 items from the peak of the gem pile. One was an eyeball containing layers of light doors, and the other was a translucent, strangely shaped key. She held them out to Klein, and Klein's expression immediately turned disappointed. "They're not real gems." He shifted his gaze without a hint of reluctance, looking at the 2 items in Alice's hand. Those were undoubtedly the uniqueness of the door pathway and the Beander characteristic of Sequence 1 Key of Stars. Saphira Castle stirred restlessly upon their appearance, but Klein forcibly suppressed it. He said thoughtfully, "It's a good thing you didn't take them out when Grisha was here just now, otherwise I might not have been able to suppress the aggregation reaction." Taking what he was due, Klein then asked, "And then?" Alice then waved her hand, put away the pile of gems on the ground, pulled out a monocle from her body, held it up to Klein's eyes, waved it around, and then asked, "Does it look familiar, Mr. Fool?" Error uniqueness, Klein asked subconsciously. Alice looked at him quietly and said unceremoniously, "Our great visionary, the former sun god, should not have gone far. If you catch up now, you might still be able to beg a daydream from him." Klein was silent for a moment, then asked as if nothing had happened, What is this? Alice glanced at Klein and said calmly. Eamon said this is a token of love between you and him. Klein almost choked on his saliva, but even so, he still felt like he couldn't catch his breath and said in surprise. Say that again. Alice then repeated. Eamon said this is a token of love between you and him. Klein rubbed his ears and said rather speechlessly. You wouldn't believe this, would you? All right, I know what this is. Eamon told me that if you went to him for verification after learning something from me, he would also need to take out something to deceive you, but the rose oath on him had already been destroyed. After I heard that, I gave him this monocle. 6. Alice praised with a numb expression. I thought his latter reason was true, but it turns out the first one was true. Is this really a token of love? Or not? Never mind, say whatever you want. What reason did you just say? Klein asked with a frown. Alice glanced at Klein and replied indifferently. He initially said it was a token of love between you and him. After being reprimanded by his father, he changed his story and said he stole it from you, but without your permission, he couldn't have stolen anything. Then, he said it should be considered purchased, since he helped you complete the ritual of fooling fate, and this was his deserved reward. I originally thought that stealing it with your tacit consent was more credible, but I didn't expect. Klein, did you really give him a token of love? What happened during your visit to Eternal Blazing Sun? Klein dared not retort, he chose to change the subject. Did you two talk about something? This method was effective. Alice and Klein briefly mentioned the problem with Eternal Blazing Sun, then laughed. Oh, he also told me something. Do you know that among the 8 kings of angels back then, 3 of them attached themselves to him from their weakest stages and gradually grew under his patronage? Klein showed an interested expression. Could it be? No, I remember wisdom should have been a vassal of the dragon of imagination Anquelt. Aha, Alice knew what Klein was thinking as soon as she heard it, and laughed. Of course not wisdom, but Storm and Pure White both were, and besides them, there was Ouroboros. Ouroboros. Klein was slightly startled. I've heard you talk about him. He is almost completely obedient to fate. You're mentioning him now, could it be? Alice glanced at Klein, her expression inexplicable. Grisha told me that Ouroboros proactively requested him, wanting to become my pope. He said that Ouroboros believed this was the guidance of fate. That's a bit scary, Klein said sincerely. He wouldn't stab you in the back one day, would he? I don't know, Alice shook her head, but I want to keep him. What I was thinking at the time was that I really needed a suitable pope, and Ouroboros, he has rich experience. However, I still think the angels I cultivate myself would be more reliable. At this point, Grisha told me. She glanced at Klein, her expression hard to describe. Klein's mouth twitched, and he added. 2 of the kings of angels he cultivated himself betrayed him, and another is about to betray him. End of chapter. Chapter 702 Chalter 94, Light Chaser and Seer. Chapter 702, Chapter 94 Lightseeker and Soothsayer. Not preparing to betray, Alice corrected. It's actively applying to him. Oh, to be honest, I think it's more like a diplomatic encounter. Klein was inclined to agree with this statement. He shook his head with complex emotions, a touch of melancholy in his expression, but he said nothing. Alice, however, brought up a subsequent matter. Oh right, there's also. She frowned, her tone slightly hesitant. He seems to think my excessive attention to the demoness pathway is a revelation of fate, and intends to investigate. Klein was stunned. But you clearly. He paused, then suddenly fell silent again. After observing Alice quietly for 2 seconds, he said thoughtfully. It's because you and I are too familiar that we've overlooked certain things. The Wheel of Fortune can already be considered a certain degree of incarnation of fate. Interpreting your actions and seeing them as a revelation of fate isn't wrong. Rather, ever since you obtained the dice of probability, someone should have started doing this. After all, angels of the corresponding pathway are symbols themselves, and you, who possess the uniqueness, are even more special. He patted Alice's head, who was looking at him as if he were an idiot, then laughed. I know, perhaps you didn't have many thoughts when you did that, but the guidance of fate can sometimes be very subtle, can't it? So, Alice withdrew her previous gaze and looked Klein up and down. Are you going to do reading comprehension on me from now on, Mr. Fool? Just like interpreting the words and actions of some important figure. Quote. It sounds like it. Klein glanced at Alice, his expression unchanged. Great goddess of light. Alice's expression froze for a moment. She clearly didn't like being called that to her face, especially when the person was Klein. Her expression became even stranger. Klein didn't provoke her further. After calling out to her playfully, he asked Alice, "You should be returning the Beander characteristic to the Abraham family next, right?" Alice nodded, and Klein smiled. "Then I won't bother you. I'm going to see the Transmigrators on Saphira Castle." With that, without waiting for Alice to ask more, Klein left. Alice shook her head in place, then proactively went to find the magician Furs and the Abraham family. Alice had intended to keep the Beander characteristic for Furs's future advancement, to prevent the Abraham family from holding her, an outsider, back on the advancement characteristic. After all, for Klein, Furs, who was in the Tarot Club, was truly one of his own. But after a brief conversation, Alice quickly discovered that Furs didn't have much desire to advance. Alice gave up on this unnecessary help and returned all the Beander characteristics to the Abraham family. As for how they would distribute them, Alice didn't care. After a few quiet days at Mage Manor, Alice finally received Ouroboros's prayer. This angel of destiny was very good at choosing prayer locations. He chose Grisha Adams' church. Facing the cross symbol above Ouroboros, Alice felt an indescribable speechlessness. She gritted her teeth and responded to the prayer, politely asking him, quote, "I don't ask you to believe in me, or rather, I even appreciate your devout faith, and I do have such needs, plus, well, although it sounds like a joke that all the angels who followed him from his weak days betrayed him, if you think about it carefully, he was actually speaking up for you, right? I appreciate your piety, and I appreciate your relationship, but you don't have to provoke me like this, do you? Why don't you pray to me in a different place?" Then, under Alice's gaze, Ouroboros took this revelation and prayed to Grisha Adam, asking for instructions on his next move. Alice watched, clutching her chest, and decided not to respond to anything Ouroboros said next. Grisha Adam seemed to have anticipated her state of mind, because Alice didn't receive a prayer next. Ouroboros appeared directly in the nursery room, knelt on the ground in Alice's dumbfounded gaze, lowered his head, and emotionlessly called out, "Goddess of light." Quote. Alice raised her hand to cover her head. "I'm starting to regret this. Why don't you get up and sit? Can you turn into a chair yourself?" Alice blinked at Ouroboros. Ouroboros looked up at her for 2 seconds, then shook his head, stood up, and replied, "Sitting in front of you would be disrespectful. You're already quite disrespectful to me." Alice rolled her eyes, waved him over, and propped herself up to sit, saying, "You're too tall standing, wait a moment, I'll get you a chair." It wasn't until Alice placed a chair in front of the crib and ordered Ouroboros to sit down that she glanced at Ouroboros's linen robe, thought for a moment, and asked, "Is that still the one your lord gave you?" Ouroboros nodded, but replied, "You may touch it." "Why?" Alice asked subconsciously, then immediately realized, "Oh, your lord is alive again, you don't need to rely on clothes for a substitute meal." Quote. Ouroboros looked at her calmly, saying nothing. Alice felt a strange sense of guilt. She crawled forward, grabbed the linen robe, and looked up to ask, "Can you hold a baby?" Ouroboros looked down at her, then picked her up. His posture was very practiced, and Alice couldn't help but exclaim, "Did you used to take care of Aemon?" Quote. Ouroboros nodded, his expression calm. Quote. "Then that makes sense." Alice's mouth twitched. "Don't you have anything to say to me? Didn't you ask to be my pope?" "I just felt I should do so," he replied. In other words, he doesn't feel there's anything he needs to do right now. Alice understood. She couldn't help but ask curiously, "I want to confirm, do you feel you should believe in me, or do you feel you should stay by my side and become my pope?" "The latter," he said concisely. "What if the revelation of fate is for you to believe in me?" Alice blinked, curving into a mischievous smile. Ouroboros was uncharacteristically silent. Alice stared at him, her voice laced with temptation. "Will you betray your beloved lord, Ouroboros?" "I do not wish to receive such a revelation," he replied slowly, "but the answer you wish to hear is probably not this one." Alice nodded, acknowledging his words. So Ouroboros's expression became ethereal, and he continued to answer. I'm not sure. At this moment, I'd rather refuse, but before I truly receive such a revelation, I cannot really be certain of my answer. I see, Alice nodded thoughtfully. How should a church be built? Do you have any ideas? Ouroboros lowered his head and asked gently. Alice shook her head, thinking as she answered. To be honest, not really. What are other gods' churches like? They are similar in form, including the Aurora Order, the Demonist sect, and other cult organizations, Ouroboros answered fluently. You can divide their members into ordinary members, combat members, saints, and angels. Each level has someone responsible for leading. If it were the Lord's former church, there would also be a king of angels to lead the angels. Alice was stunned. She nodded thoughtfully and said, so, it can actually be considered divided by sequence levels, right? Yes, Ouroboros nodded. However, we usually give each level of member a code name. Ah, Alice blinked. I know that. The 7 gods, there are no 7 gods now. In short, the Orthodox Church's saints and angels have a title. Some take one, some don't. Those with titles have a relatively special status, right? Ouroboros nodded, acknowledging, that's right. Alice stroked her chin, then continued. No rush for this. I don't have many people in total. Compared to that, ordinary members and elite combat members are probably more concerning. Like the Nighthawks and the Red Gloves, I should give them names, shouldn't I? Ouroboros still nodded. Alice thought for a moment, then said. To be honest, I actually wanted to name existences similar to the Red Gloves, Soothsayer, but, I suppose your lord must have told you. I refer to myself as the goddess of light in the holy book. Yes, Ouroboros nodded, I know about that. Receiving his affirmative answer, Alice sighed, then continued. The name, Soothsayer, doesn't sound very related to goddess of light, or rather, it's at least very far-fetched. Let me think. How about seer? As you decide, Ouroboros said calmly. This meant he had no objections or ideas. Alice shook her head, raised an eyebrow, and smiled. Then it's settled for now. Let me think about ordinary members. Nighthawks, the Night Church, Machinery Hivemind, the Steam Church, Punishers, the Storm Church, Light. Her voice suddenly stopped. She glanced at Ouroboros thoughtfully, her tone becoming erratic. Can I call such ordinary members, Lightseeker? What? Ouroboros was stunned, as if he hadn't reacted. Lightseeker, Alice repeated the name, her tone becoming firm. What do you think? Ouroboros's expression looked a bit blank. He asked. You should know that the sequence 2 of the Sun pathway is called. So what? Alice shook her head. Isn't it perfectly reasonable for the followers of the Goddess of Light to be Lightseeker? Ouroboros said nothing. He didn't seem very keen to agree with this, but Alice's reasoning was sound and unassailable. Alice blinked innocently, saying nothing. Compared to seer, which was a variation of soothsayer, the title, Lightseeker, was indeed something Alice came up with on a whim. Alice, who had seen the blasphemy slate, naturally knew what the sequence 2 of the Sun pathway was called. In fact, it was precisely because of this that she thought of it. Literally, Lightseeker means someone who seeks light. It is perfectly reasonable for the followers of the Goddess of Light to be Lightseeker. However, there was another reason for Alice to use this name. As a child who didn't like to read, she didn't know much about serious knowledge, but she knew quite a bit about various myths, fairy tales, and fables. Therefore, Alice remembered that when many people mentioned Apollo, their first impression was the sun god. It seemed that the imagery of light and the sun was too close, and it also seemed to be due to the evolution of legends. In the era of Alice's memory, many people regarded Apollo as the sun god, but in reality, the sun god was someone else. And at first, Alice called herself the goddess of light. Besides the outer deity at the top of this pathway being called the key of light, another important reason was that Apollo simultaneously held the authority of light and fate. What? You said Apollo had other authorities. What did that have to do with her? In short, for these reasons, when referring to corresponding titles, Alice actually actively sought out areas related to the sun. If she hadn't been unclear about what the members of the Eternal Blazing Sun Church were called, she might have considered moving over. No, she should actually be able to know, just by taking a look. Alice shook her head, not continuing to think, but instead tried to persuade Ouroboros. Don't you think it makes sense? The imagery of light and the sun is inherently close. I don't think this name is excessive, and I believe the future sun god will not quibble with me over such a small matter. As for the current sun god, that white angel, I mean, you wouldn't care about a trader's opinion, would you? Ouroboros was silent for a few seconds before saying, I have only seen a deity like you for the first time, a deity like you. Have you decided? What? Alice raised an eyebrow. Are you going to go back and ask your lord for his opinion? No, Ouroboros shook his head. May I see your holy book? Alice waved her hand and handed it over. She watched Ouroboros pick up the book, then suddenly remembered something and instructed him. Oh, right, I remember, Ouroboros, my holy symbol doesn't seem to be settled yet. Could you draw one for me? I remember you should be able to draw, and the prayer gesture. I think the goddess of light's prayer gesture would be quite strange if it were the previous symbol. How about I change it to drawing a circle? That way people will think it's drawing the sun. Chapter 703 Chapter 95 Yin and Yang combine to create all things. Chapter 703, Chapter 95, the union of yin and yang gives rise to all things. When Ouroboros turned his gaze to Alice, his eyes remained calm, as if he accepted such an irresponsible deity well, only asking. Do you have any thoughts on the holy symbol? You play tarot cards, don't you? Alice asked. Ouroboros nodded, and Alice then smiled. You can refer to the Wheel of Fortune card in it. I don't have any more ideas, you can decide for yourself. Ouroboros nodded, then continued. The holy book should explain the meaning of the prayer gesture. You can design the prayer gesture as drawing a circle, but it doesn't have any practical meaning. Then what do you think should be done? Alice humbly asked for his advice. Ouroboros pondered for 2 seconds, then said. The doctrine of the eternal blazing sun involves fairness and justice, which is also reflected in fate. Since you adopted Lightseeker as the name for your followers, the prayer gesture could be a scale, which aligns with your thoughts and also has a connection to light. Alice looked at him in surprise and blurted out, You're holding a grudge, aren't you? I'm just considering the problem from your perspective, Ouroboros replied calmly. If you insist on using the circular gesture, it's not impossible, but what it specifically symbolizes still needs consideration. His serious attitude, however, made Alice feel bored. She frowned, glanced at Ouroboros, then waved her hand and said. Whatever you want, it doesn't really matter anyway. Ouroboros, Sequence 8 is called robot, but it doesn't mean you have to act like a robot. No, a simulated robot should even be able to cry and laugh, just unable to understand. Oh, right, she suddenly realized and shouted with a smile, Ouroboros, can you smile for me? Question mark. Ouroboros looked extremely confused. He cooperatively showed a smile, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Alice didn't mind. She shook her head and asked again, then can you cry? Question mark. Ouroboros didn't continue to cooperate. He dropped the expression on his face and politely asked, Do you have anything else? Alice thought for a moment and replied, I don't think so. In that case, Ouroboros said, putting Alice back in the crib, I will come to see you again once the image of the holy symbol is designed. After saying all this, he left without hesitation, leaving Alice dumbfounded. The transmigrators on Saphira Castle were all released by Klein, but no matter how Alice asked, Klein refused to reveal anything. Feeling rebuffed, Alice, for the first time in a while, contacted Roy King. This demigod from the life school of thought was clearly already aware of the birth of the Wheel of Fortune. When Alice appeared, he showed little surprise and immediately began to praise the great goddess of fate. Alice waited quietly for him to finish, then asked with a curious tone. Truly great. However, can you tell me who the goddess of fate is? This question stumped Roy King. He subconsciously blurted out, Aren't you her? Alice chuckled and replied, Of course not, I am the goddess of light. Roy King was only briefly stunned. Then he quickly reorganized his words, transferring his effusive praise for the goddess of fate to the goddess of light, even swiftly connecting fate with light, highly commending Alice's naming skills. Alice held her stomach, laughing heartily. Of course, she hadn't personally gone to see Roy King, she was still in Mage Manor at the moment, and to laugh more freely, she had sealed off the sound in the room. Once she had laughed enough, Alice refocused her attention on Roy King and gave him her guidance. Go find Ouroboros. His honorific name is. More things, Ouroboros will tell you. After saying that, she no longer paid attention to Roy King, but Roy King still respectfully responded, piously praising her, then whispered in a tone of barely concealed doubt. A subordinate of the true creator. Perhaps Ouroboros's honorific name had been changed, but Ouroboros didn't mention it, and Alice didn't ask. Roy King still received the original version. Roy King pondered the relationship between this new Wheel of Fortune and the true creator while praying to Ouroboros and received an address. When he arrived, the silver-haired King of Angels was holding a paintbrush, sketching something on paper. Roy King stood still, not daring to disturb him, but Ouroboros put down the paintbrush and looked up, saying, "Are you from the life school of thought?" "Yes." Roy King nodded. Ouroboros nodded and directly asked, "How many Beander characteristics or potion ingredients of the fate pathway does the life school of thought have?" At the mention of this, Roy King breathed a sigh of relief. He puffed out his chest and smiled confidently. "Many. Although the life school of thought declined after Will Osepton left and suffered persecution from the Rose school of thought, we have always been quite affluent financially. We have stored a large number of Beander characteristics below the demigod level, or mystical items made from these Beander characteristics, or potion ingredients. Those above the demigod level are relatively fewer, but still sufficient." He paused here, then continued with a tone of regret. Before Will Osepton left the life school of thought, he left behind a soothsayer Beander characteristic. However, this Beander characteristic was snatched away by the Rose school of thought. Ouroboros nodded, then asked for detailed information about potion ingredients, as well as Beyonders who were still alive and contactable. After Roy King answered each question, he said, "Go gather them." As he spoke, he picked up the drawing paper and a book from the table, handing them both to Roy King, and said calmly, This is the goddess's holy book and holy symbol." As he spoke, his eyelids drooped, and he instinctively glanced westward before continuing. Quote. "The task of recording the contents of the holy book, building churches, and spreading the goddess's faith is entrusted to you. When you have problems, you can pray to me." Roy King lowered his head in a daze. On the paper was a drawing of a disc, with a very small inner circle, black in color, and a large area of cyan gold in the outer circle. On the outer layer of the disc, there was also a white giant snake, loosely coiled around the disc, its head and tail connected. There were 8 bronze pointers on the disc, evenly distributed, but the 4 on the top, bottom, left, and right were longer, and the other 4 were shorter. After a quick glance, Roy King refocused his attention and respectfully bowed goodbye. After seeing Roy King off, Ouroboros quietly turned around and raised his hand, steadily drawing a cross on his chest. Alice, of course, knew none of this. She hadn't even thought of collecting the Beander characteristics of the fate pathway or sealing the potion formulas. It was only after Roy King left and Ouroboros reminded her that she thought of it. After that, things seemed to have little to do with her. Although Grisha Adam didn't seem to have any immediate plans to truly act against Storms, Wisdom, and Blazing Sun, the existing true gods had tacitly reached out to their followers. Although there was no war, they were trying to snatch away the people's faith. No one paid much attention to Alice, who was taking advantage of the situation. After all, the number of followers of the 3 orthodox deities was very large, and this new Wheel of Fortune had a very good reputation. In the absence of fundamental conflicts of interest, no one would want to go against her. Moreover, going against fate just sounds unlucky, even though the Wheel of Fortune, for some unknown reason, insisted on calling herself the Goddess of Light. Most people's attitude was silence, and in this silence, Alice once again welcomed Grisha Adam. This future God Almighty formally presented an invitation and then brought her an ocean of ice cream. Conjured out of thin air. Alice was greatly shocked. Before she could ask, Grisha Adam began to talk about his discoveries and plans. "I investigated the situation of Cheek in the mirror world, as well as the parts of the City of Calamity left outside. As you said, there might indeed be problems there. To avoid alarming Cheek, I didn't conduct too deep an investigation into her or the mirror world, but considering that the primordial one once contained the city of calamity, I suspect that the demoness pathway might also contain a resurrection contingency of the primordial one. However, dealing with all this is also very simple. We just need to cultivate a stable and pure calamity of destruction, and everything will fall apart on its own. Then what do you plan to do? Alice asked in a good mood. Grisha Adam pondered for a few seconds, then spoke. I remember you, the mysteries, and Rosal should all be from the same country. Alice nodded hesitantly, and Grisha Adam continued. I just talked to the mysteries about the city of calamity. The mysteries told me that he had already contacted the West Continent and heard a saying from there. As he spoke, Grisha Adam seemed to recall for a moment before reciting the text in a rather unfamiliar and peculiar tone. Solitary yin does not grow, solitary yang does not produce. Within yin lies yang, and within yang lies yin. When yin and yang combine, all things arise, this is the way of heaven. Note 1. Huh. Alice was bewildered. Do you know what this sentence means? Grisha Adam looked at her and asked, the mysteries explained it to me, but I want to hear your thoughts. He paused, then added. This sentence should be related to the birth of the outer deity represented by the city of calamity. Also, I think you should know that among the two pathways to which the city of calamity belongs, demoness represents feminine disaster, and red priest represents masculine war. But, Alice swallowed. I think a mere city of calamity shouldn't be worthy of being called the way of heaven. The primordial one, God Almighty, feels a bit like it, but. She swallowed with difficulty, and asked with a hesitant tone, the primordial one, is there a possibility of his resurrection? Question mark. Grisha Adam's gaze suddenly deepened. He looked at Alice without saying a word. Several minutes passed before he spoke in a deep voice. You believe only the primordial one can be called the way of heaven. Rather, that's our definition of the way of heaven. Alice frowned and said, let me think. It shouldn't be the creator, but, the most fundamental principle or will of the universe. That is to say, for us, the way of heaven is probably equivalent to the spirit of the primordial one, the creator. She paused, then hesitated to add. And this passage really sounds very, whether it's yin and yang, or way of heaven, these two words are a bit too grand. I understand, Grisha Adams said in a deep voice, I will consider this opinion. Alice looked at him uneasily, then, as if suddenly remembering something, asked. Oh, right, do you still remember Medici? Grisha Adam nodded calmly and asked, what about him? Alice looked at him thoughtfully and hesitated to speak. You seem to be very emotional. You don't seem willing to give up on your former subordinates. I mean the eternal blazing sun, your white angel. Of course, I guess you also want to preserve some strength for the apocalypse, or there are other reasons, but no matter what, I think, if it were you, you would never send your red angel out as a sacrifice like Adam did back then, right? What do you want to say? Grisha Adam nodded slightly and asked. Alice thought for a moment and asked. Have you thought about how to deal with his matter? And, since you plan to cultivate a stable and pure calamity of destruction, have you considered him? After all, he was once your king of angels, and his status is high enough. With the apocalypse approaching, picking from existing high sequences is better than starting from scratch, right? Grisha Adam glanced at her, then shook his head and said. You've overlooked a problem. In the past, when the Adam you speak of, used him as a stepping stone for Tudor's advancement, he still believed it was Adam, a fanatic who wanted his father to resurrect within him. But now, we have merged, and he should already know the truth about Adam. So, Alice, for him, it was the Lord he believed in who betrayed him. Alice stood frozen. She opened her mouth to say something, then fell silent. A few seconds later, she hesitated again. Then what are you planning? Grisha Adams' gaze swept over her, then looked into the non-existent distance, shaking his head and saying. I'm afraid even if I tell him now that I plan to cultivate him to become the calamity of destruction, he might not trust me. He might suspect. You're once again treating him as a stepping stone, Alice said softly. I'm very sorry to bring this up to you. Grisha Adam shook his head and said. Rather than that, I hope you won't be so lively when you face Ouroboros. Chapter 704 Chapter 96 16 Years I. Next up, let's talk about the story of the Lord of Saphira Castle. The Lord of Saphira Castle. Who is that? In the summer of 1368, 16-year-old Alice Moretti stood on the rockery in the back garden of the Church of Light Monastery, looking at the dozen or so children gathered in a semicircle below, and revealed a mysterious smile. The Lord of Saphira Castle. Perhaps we should start with what Saphira Castle is. Legend has it that Saphira Castle is located in the legendary spirit world. Have you heard of the 7 lights of the spirit world? Not yet. It doesn't matter. These are the 7 administrators of the spirit world. You should have already learned what the spirit world is, right? Yes, you can think of them as the strongest beings in the spirit world, and the 7 lights of the spirit world are merely attendants of Saphira Castle. Wow! The children exclaimed in unison, discussing animatedly, then the Lord of Saphira Castle must be very powerful. Of course, the silver-haired, silver-eyed girl curved her lips. She wore a matching hooded robe, was barefoot, and her features carried an inherent sense of compassion. The red mole between her eyebrows made her seem as if she had just stepped out of a religious painting. But do you know why he is so powerful, able to become the Lord of Saphira Castle? No idea. The children shook their heads in unison. Because, the girl blinked her eyes lightly, glancing towards the garden entrance. This Lord of Saphira Castle once ascended to the astral world, visiting the Lord of the astral world. There are rumors that he once shared the joy of life with the Lord of the astral world. The joy of life? A child asked curiously, what is that? The girl glanced at the garden entrance again before tilting her head and speaking. It is said that by doing so, one can personally conceive a child and experience the joy of life being born. Just like drinking the holy relic of the Church of the Earth Mother, the legendary mother-child river water, that you mentioned before. The child asked again. Not the same, not the same. The girl took a step back, leaping off the rockery, her voice coming from behind it. Drinking the mother-child river water, whether male or female, will result in pregnancy. That is a special blessing, while the joy of life, in most cases, can only make women pregnant. So there are special cases then. The child persisted. Yes, the girl nodded lightly, her voice still receding. But, that will have to wait until next time I tell you all. Then, under the astonished gaze of the children, the girl leapt lightly, her hand grasping the wall, pulling herself onto the eaves. Then, she stood on the wall, turned back, and smiled at them. If I don't run now, my dear Pope will probably come and drag me back, bye-bye. With that, she leapt off the wall and disappeared, leaving behind a dozen children looking at each other in confusion. They exchanged glances in silence. Before anyone could speak, a silver-haired figure appeared at the entrance like a ghost. He wore a linen robe with a silver cross hanging from his chest. His face was beautiful, his contours soft, like an angel pitying the world in every religious painting. He was also barefoot, yet he treated the pebbles and dirt on the ground as nothing. As soon as the children saw him, they held their breath, lined up neatly, and respectfully bowed, saying, Pope. This was Ouroboros, the Pope of the Church of Light. For these children, who grew up in the church monastery and knew of beyonder existences since childhood, this Pope had another identity. He was an archangel on earth, a true mythical creature. The young-looking Pope calmly swept his gaze over them, slowly nodded, and his voice was extremely cold when he spoke. Have you seen the Saintess? The children looked at each other. Some guiltily glanced at the wall where someone had just climbed over. This glance was noticed by Ouroboros. He stared at that child and asked, where did she go? Saintess, she, the child, under his gaze, guiltily lowered their head and stammered, she climbed over the wall and ran away. Ouroboros quietly glanced at them, and his figure disappeared on the spot. The children were not surprised by this, they all breathed a sigh of relief, accustomed to this strange scene. They knew full well that even the girl who had just left, the Saintess of the Church of Light, climbing over the wall was merely a facade. Every child who grew up in the church knew that the Saintess of the Church of Light was an archangel on earth, and also the incarnation of their goddess of light walking among humans. This was written in the Holy Book, and even without that, they had personally witnessed this Saintess emerge from her portrait amidst prayers, asking them what they wished for, to the full church. Of course, I'm sorry, I just remembered I have some other matters. The young coachman, wearing a monocle on his right eye and with a head of black curly hair, suddenly changed his tone, refused his customer, and pulled his carriage away without hesitation, leaving the customer bewildered. The young coachman didn't care about the expression of that customer just now. He turned and pulled the carriage into an alley, then turned back to pull open the curtain of the carriage. A silver-haired girl was sitting inside the carriage, smiling at him. "When you don't speak, you actually have a bit of the Saintess of Light's temperament," the young man sighed, shaking his head. "Who is looking for you this time?" "Of course, it's your former colleague and current colleague, and also your brother in a sense," the girl spread her hands and replied. "My dear Pope is displeased that I fabricated rumors about his lord, and is searching for me everywhere." "Oh, how pitiful," the young man responded without much emotion, "you made me miss a customer." Quote. The girl was stunned. "Do you have to be so dedicated in your acting? My dear redemption angel. Then what should I do?" The young man raised an eyebrow at her. "Do you want me to become your new pope, great goddess of light?" Quote. "If your dream of being pope hasn't ended yet, I recommend you go back to your father." The girl rolled her eyes. "I think he is the only one who might agree to it." Clap, 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 the young man clapped for her indifferently. "Your mother also advised me of this, goddess of light." The girl was about to say something else when suddenly, as if she sensed something, her expression changed drastically. Quote. "I'm leaving first, bye-bye." Quote. The young man raised his eyebrows in surprise, watching the girl's figure fade away on the spot. Is she playing hide and seek? It was now 1368. 6 years had passed since the barrier outside Earth was forcibly broken by the mother goddess of depravity, causing war. At that time, this goddess of light had already accommodated the key of light, becoming an outer deity, and had accommodated a Beander characteristic of a redemption angel. In that war, which should have represented the apocalypse, with the help of the Lord of the Mysteries, she obtained the corresponding uniqueness and the remaining 2 sequence 1 Beander characteristics. The circle of inevitability, having lost all of this, was currently sealed. This goddess of light had not yet attempted to accommodate it. And as the Pope of the Church of Light, Ouroboros was merely a sequence 2 archangel. If this goddess of light, who bore the title of saintess but was actually a god, truly wanted to hide, how could she be found? The young man, who had obtained a Beander characteristic of a redemption angel, Amen, smiled and said to the pursuing Ouroboros, "You're too late." Watching Ouroboros's figure also disappear on the spot, Amen lightly shook his head, thoughtfully saying, "I remember, she should still be able to give out one more Beander characteristic of a redemption angel." This was the sequence 1 corresponding to the circle of inevitability. Amen had set his sights on this pathway after going to the cosmos, because the abilities of sequence 2 and sequence 3 of this pathway were, in a sense, very suitable for him. The sequence 3 inches suffering 1 could bestow the suffering one had endured upon a target, which meant replicating attacks one had previously suffered, while the sequence 2 inches sinner could return one's state to any past moment. Although it required the consent of the current wielder when involving the power of uniqueness, he thought his father would help him solve this problem. However, as the apocalypse approached, and the barrier outside Earth grew thinner day by day, the circle of inevitability finally, along with other outer deities, attempted to prematurely infiltrate its power into Earth, to have a sequence 1 archangel descend within the barrier before the apocalypse, to scheme for the key of light in advance. Amen seized this opportunity. He had intended to exchange for the fate of that redemption angel, thereby accommodating the Beander characteristic of the redemption angel and jumping to the sequence 1 corresponding to the circle of inevitability. But unexpectedly, the Lord of the Mysteries opened a gap in the barrier of the West Continent. Alice, who called herself the Goddess of Light but was actually the Wheel of Fortune, entered the West Continent. By the time Amen was ready with the help of his father, the new Key of Light had also been born, and it fulfilled the prophecy of Light of Redemption, she wrote in the Holy Book, swallowing the Beander characteristic of the redemption angel. All his preparations were useless, and he even had to be mocked. Amen was naturally not happy, but after mocking Amen, Alice gave him a new option. "If you come and be my archangel, I'll consider giving you a sequence 1 later on, since I don't need that many anyway. How about it, my redemption angel?" Looking at Alice, who stood before him with her hand extended, Eamon unhesitatingly grasped that hand, smiling as he responded, "All right." Thus, this deal was completed. The Lord of the Mysteries, Klein, was actually very dissatisfied with this. He had privately asked Alice why she did this, and received a reasonable answer. Don't you think it would be especially fun to have the embodiment of deception and mischief as the redemption angel? Just think, when you think you're finally going to be saved, you find out it's a prank. Then, Klein covered his face and left, going to Grisha Adam for parenting advice. And Eamon, not long after his return, met his former colleague and current colleague, Ouroboros, who had become Pope. After a brief thought, he consulted the Holy Book of the Fool Church. When he realized that the Angel of Time was still among them, Eamon unhesitatingly sought out the Lord of the Mysteries, asking if he had any thoughts of replacing the Pope, and directly stated his interest in the position. Then, the Lord of the Mysteries deleted him from the Holy Book and replaced him with Pale's Zoroaster. Alice was still enjoying this game of hide-and-seek. As Eamon guessed, if she truly didn't want to be found by Ouroboros, it would be very easy. Ultimately, Ouroboros was able to find her so quickly because she was spreading rumors while live streaming to Ouroboros. Although Grisha Adam had warned her not to be too lively when facing Ouroboros, it clearly had no effect. The main reason for this was that Grisha Adam didn't have time to manage her. After asking Alice about her thoughts on that strange statement, Grisha Adam, troubled, sought out Klein again. No one knew what they discussed, but Grisha Adam and Klein left Saphira Castle together with solemn expressions, entering the mirror world together. Afterward, they witnessed what was truly meant by, when yin and yang combine, all things arise. The original creator, he was the collection of all contradictions in the world. He was all possibilities and impossibilities. He was both mad and rational, both desiring aggregation and desiring division, both filled with self-destructive desires, and desiring to survive. The City of Calamity was such a special existence. Its two subordinate pathways, the hunter pathway, symbolized war and destruction, and also the masculine aspect of the original creator. The demoness pathway symbolized disaster and the apocalypse, and also the feminine aspect of the original creator. And the primordial demoness, Cheek, he, along with the Blood Emperor, Tudor, was actually plotting to unite the feminine and masculine aspects of the original creator, to give birth to a rational, clear-headed original creator. He even created a mirror original creator. Of course, when Klein and Grisha Adam discovered all this, the mirror original creator had not yet truly been born. It was only a prototype. But Cheek had already changed his fifth honorific name to the Mirror Original Creator, making one wonder how much sanity he still possessed. If it were just this, it would be fine. Cheek's fourth honorific name was the Female Body of the Primordial God Almighty, and the City of Calamity also bore traces left by the Primordial God Almighty. This made dealing with this matter particularly difficult. The City of Calamity was currently like a bomb, where cutting the wrong wire could cause it to explode. When Alice learned of this, her response was, "No wonder the outer deity represented by the City of Calamity is called Calamity of Destruction, and Root of Disaster. So it's a mess, huh? But I'm still very surprised. I originally thought that the reason the primordial demoness harbored malice towards all female demonesses was his jealousy. I didn't expect it to be because of the mirror original creator. Tisk, this isn't fun anymore." She shook her head and sighed in disappointment, leaving Klein, who had come to inquire at Grisha Adam's suggestion, empty-handed. End of this chapter. Chapter 705 Chapter 97 16 Years Part 2. Alice had long decided who to look for next. First, Medici was ruled out. After realizing the problem with the City of Calamity, the Demoness Pathways ritual for becoming a god was brought up again. Grisha Adam believed this ritual offered a possibility, the birth of the calamity of destruction without the original creator's revival. Using another type of pollution as an intermediary barrier, thus preventing the demoness pathway and the hunter pathway from truly merging. So, what kind of pollution should be used? Alice, after hearing this speculation, turned to Klein. Using Chaos Sea would revive the primordial God Almighty, so should Saphira Castle be used? After all, we can't use the mother goddess of depravity's pollution, can we? This is exactly what I'm considering, Grisha Adam replied. I've observed the Demoness Pathways promotion rituals and acting method from Sequence 9 to Sequence 1. The core of this pathway is to maintain oneself. Its God-becoming ritual should also focus on maintaining oneself amidst pollution, but the primordial God Almighty modified the ritual, limiting the pollution to chaos C. He paused, then added, if we refer to the rituals of other true gods, perhaps pollution at the true God level would have been enough, but that would make it extremely dangerous when promoting to an outer deity. So, to be safe, it's probably still best to use Sephira-level pollution, and ideally, pollution from a Sephira corresponding to a pillar. Sephira Castle is indeed an option, but the Mother Goddess of Depravity's pollution is not entirely unfeasible. There is Mother Goddess of Depravity's pollution on Earth. Absolutely not. Alice showed a look of extreme horror. Have you ever thought that she is the root of calamity? Right now, this source of disaster is at least contained. If it's the Mother Goddess of Depravity's pollution, would she directly give birth to some strange things? Then, the Mother Goddess of Depravity's pollution successfully became a discarded plan. After excluding the obviously problematic Chaos C, Sephira Castle became the final choice. As for the final candidate, although it was indeed Medici, Grisha Adam and Medici's reconciliation took a lot of time, and Amon's contribution was indispensable in this. Yes, the birth of the calamity of destruction occurred after Alice's promotion to Key of Light and her accommodation of the Redemption Angel's Beander characteristic. This was a very special kind of insurance. For those recognized as her own people by the Key of Light itself, there would be a continuous blessing of luck. This was a special characteristic as an incarnation of fate, which the Wheel of Fortune had displayed, but not clearly enough. Luck could be of great use at certain moments. However, the calamity of destruction's condition was still not good enough. After the war, he entered a state of slumber, maintaining stability in his dreams. Alice wouldn't hide in her dreams just to avoid Ouroboros. Alice went to find Rosal. As the current nation of disorder, after Alice cried, made a fuss, and demanded to teach Bernadette Chinese, Rosal finally gave up on pursuing his old diaries and calmly accepted the fact that his image in the eyes of his fellow transmigrator juniors had been shattered. Then, Rosal heard Alice instigating Bernadette to call her aunt. She seemed to genuinely regard Bernadette as a junior, but Rosal couldn't accept this. In his eyes, this fellow countryman was probably more like a niece, mainly because the fellow countryman he regarded as an equal obviously raised this girl as his daughter. When Alice knocked and entered, Rosal was boiling mushrooms. Yes, the mushrooms frankly researched. This renowned druid finally promoted to a demigod. Alice suggested he create a special type of mushroom that would emit different sounds based on different sensory inputs. For example, when grown normally, they wouldn't make a sound. If you put them in warm water, they would start singing. If you put them in boiling water or took a bite, they would emit a sharp scream. For the latest product, Frank Lee didn't forget his good friend Gehrman Sparrow. After getting the mushrooms, Klein looked at the mushrooms singing in the pot, remained silent for a long time, then sent a portion to each of his friends, and of course, didn't forget Rosal. Rosal found it novel, especially the process of singing in the pot. Seeing Alice visit, Rosal greeted her. "You're here. I heard you suggested these mushrooms. Want to try some later?" "No," Alice refused flatly. "I've already eaten at home." Rosal didn't mind. He turned to look at the mushrooms, muttering to himself with great curiosity. "This is truly amazing. The mushrooms, singing is even very pleasant. Just listening to it makes them seem delicious." Alice glanced at him and replied, "If it's you, having such a thought is normal. After all, you once wrote, 'The taste of a witch is really good.'" What do you mean? Rosal suddenly became cautious. "I asked Frank what these mushrooms were crossbred with." Alice shook her head. "He told me that one of the ingredients was the flesh and blood of a demoness." Rosal's expression froze. He suddenly felt a strong sense of nausea. Such an expression was too bad. Alice couldn't help but ask, "Why are you so surprised? I thought Frank's previous version would have been harder for you to accept, but I remember you were quite happy when you ate it back then." This referred to the City of Silver version of the mushrooms. Rosal's expression became more vigilant. He frowned and asked, "What was wrong with the previous version of mushrooms?" Alice raised an eyebrow and couldn't help but laugh. "Has Bernadette never mentioned it to you? She once discovered a person, her younger brother, a descendant of your eldest son Sharf. His name was Sharf. Because he was contaminated by the primordial moon, Bernadette temporarily handed him over to Katlia. You know, Frank is her crew member. Katlia assigned Sharf to be Frank's experiment assistant. Frank once told me that Sharf's strong reproductive desire provided a lot of help for the experiments. Rosal's expression twisted. The urge to gag came from within. He knew it was psychological, but he still raised his hand and destroyed the pot of mushroom soup in front of him. Alice looked at his face, silently took a step back, and then vanished from the spot. Rosal didn't stop her. This matter had nothing to do with her, she merely brought the news. If he wanted to settle scores, it should be with Frank Lee. Oh wait, who sent him the first batch of mushrooms he ate? Rosal narrowed his eyes, and the air pressure in his divine kingdom became incredibly low. It was at this moment that he frowned again and turned to look at the guest he had just let in. Ouroboros? He asked, confused. Ouroboros bowed to him, responding, I apologize for disturbing you. Have you seen Her Excellency the Saintess? She entered the river of fate. Rosal shook his head. I don't know where she went after leaving. Ouroboros thanked him in silence, then left. Your Excellency the Saintess. The dark blue-haired man looked at the young girl appearing in the air, his expression surprised. This was Alger, the hanged man, the only one in the tarot club who would call her Saintess. As for what others called her, Miss Fate. Derek, the son, nearby also noticed this scene, exclaiming in surprise, You are. He instinctively scanned the surroundings. Alger held him back, stood up, and bowed. Your Excellency the Saintess, do you have any instructions? Derek quickly stood up and followed suit. He was the current Pope of the Full Church, while Alger was the Pope of the Sea God Church. In fact, he was the Sea God himself. In the Holy Book of the Fool Church, the Sea God was a subordinate god of the Fool, known as the Punishment Angel. Although there was a suspicion of premature exaggeration, the current Alger had already become a Sequence 2 calamity, worthy of this title. Derek had also promoted to Sequence 2. Besides feeling dazed every time he saw a Lightseeker from the Church of Light, everything else seemed no different to him. It was as if when he encountered problems, he still habitually sought advice from the former Mr. Hanged Man, but the difference was that now he would occasionally offer his own ideas, making the consultation seem more like a discussion. However, in terms of discerning human hearts, he was clearly still no match for Alger. Alice smiled kindly at Alger because of the Saintess title, then told them. Shish, I'm hiding from someone. Derek's expression became enlightened. Such hide-and-seek games were uncommon, but getting into trouble and being chased was a common story for Alice. Derek was not facing this situation for the first time, and neither was Alger. He said knowingly, Do you need us to do anything? No need, Alice shook her head. I'll leave in a while. So Derek and Alger said no more. Alice glanced at them, recalling her previous conversation with Klein. They had discussed whether these Tarot Club members, who belonged to the 5 pathways under Chaos C, should be allowed to promote. In fact, the decision-making power was not in their hands, but depended on whether Grisha Atom would provide Beander characteristics. But the problem here was that even if they wanted to continue promoting, they couldn't possibly go to other churches to demand Beander characteristics. Not everyone was as shameless as Klein back then. Negotiations had to be carried out by Klein, the Lord of the Mysteries. Therefore, Klein unhesitatingly decided to let these few people remain at Sequence 2 and not promote further. As for Pales, after listing Pales as his angel, Klein separated a Worm of Time, allowing Pales to return to Sequence 1. Originally, he should have had another Archangel, but Magician Furs had no interest in promoting, having stayed at Sequence 2 for a long time. Klein felt it was more reliable to count on the Abraham family than on her. As for the King of Angels, Klein currently had no such plan. After all, Grisha Atom's precedent was there. To avoid the same story from repeating, Klein decided not to perform suicide tricks and not to create a King of Angels, not even a puppet or a clone. But he did have Archangel-level clones, and more than one, namely Attendant of Mysteries Gehrman Sparrow, Worm of Time Sherlock Moriarty, Key of Stars Merlin Hermes, and Key of Stars Don Dantes. Yes, besides the earliest Klein Moretti, he arranged one for each of his aliases. Alice merely glanced at this result, then shook her head and commented. You're like that two-dimensional mascot streamer, hiding behind a mask, not daring to show your true face to people. Alice stayed a little longer with Alger and Derek because Alger had someone deliver freshly made ice cream, said to be a special flavor of the Sea God Church. Alice took a bite. The flavor was indeed special, because this thing, it zapped the mouth. But since it wouldn't cause actual harm, Alice quickly grew fond of the cool, tingly, special sensation. She ate several before reluctantly leaving, asking Alger to send her some more later. Next, Alice made a detour to see Frank Lee. After promoting to classical alchemist, he finally gained the ability to create souls. Like a child with a new toy, he was having a lot of fun. However, Alice estimated that he had probably played with most of what he could play with, and just a slight hint of direction would make him consider promoting. As for the current Earth Mother Lilith, Alice did not visit her, because this goddess was also in a state of slumber. The Mother Goddess of Depravity ultimately failed to bring back her Mother Nest, but the Earth Mother did not have the courage to accommodate the Mother Nest to promote to an outer deity. She only accommodated the moon uniqueness and a portion of the beauty goddess's Beander characteristic, and even with just this, to maintain her sanity, she had to fall into slumber. Thinking of the Mother Goddess of Depravity, Alice recalled Rosal, whom she had just seen. After eternal darkness, the calamity of destruction, and the key of light were born, Grisha Adam finally no longer worried about the barrier. The former wisdom angel unhesitatingly handed over his Beander characteristic and uniqueness. Storm, however, preferred death to surrender, so he died. As for the eternal blazing sun, Grisha Adam had thought about saving him, but the eternal blazing sun and the primordial God Almighty had become indistinguishable after thousands of years of entanglement, and he was powerless. In the end, only a portion of the former White Angel's personality remained. Then, Klein and Grisha Adam began to deal with the pollution on Rosal. Within the barrier, there was an existence capable of clearing her own pollution. The Mother Goddess of Depravity was greatly alarmed and finally revealed her secret weapon. The Mother of all things, and of course, the Mother of the original Creator. Using the Chaos Embryo, she forcibly broke through the barrier, and she herself fell into a weakened state. However, this was a long-prepared trap. End of this chapter. Chapter 706 Chapter 98 16 Years Part 3. The Mother Goddess of Depravity possesses 4 pathways in total. 2 of these pathways, along with the Mother Nest, landed on Earth. Of the 2 pathways remaining within her, one of the sequence 0 is precisely the primordial chaos embryo. This was the trump card the Mother Goddess of Depravity had always kept, and it was also the method Alice had once suspected for opening Earth's barrier. When the Mother of all things gives birth to the primordial chaos embryo, a new original creator will be born. Of course, the Mother Goddess of Depravity also lacked the courage to allow the original creator to truly be born, as this would likewise bring about her end. Therefore, she merely utilized this pathway to open Earth's barrier, but this also caused her to enter a period of weakness. Information regarding this pathway came from Grisha Adam, who had truly become God Almighty. After confirming the existence of this ability of the Mother Goddess of Depravity, making the Mother Goddess of Depravity voluntarily remove the barrier and initiate war in a weakened state, thereby crippling the outer deity faction's pillar combat strength, became a crucial part of the war strategy. Of course, before that, the safety of ordinary people had to be ensured, and preparations had to be made as thoroughly as possible. Thus, it wasn't until the barrier grew thinner and thinner, and instances of losing control and contamination became more frequent, that this plan truly began to be executed. Katlia and Bernadette were also together. Although the hidden sage had already died at Klein's hands, Bernadette did not advance further but remained at sequence 2 as a sage. Katlia used the excess Beander characteristic expelled after Bernadette's advancement to advance to sequence 3. The sequence 2 potion came from the hidden sage's legacy, but she likewise did not continue to advance. In the original plan, the uniqueness and sequence 1 Beander characteristic of the hermit pathway should have been handed over to the god of steam and machinery, Stiano, at the time. However, this true god, born during the 4th epoch due to luck, had never adjusted his state and lacked the confidence to accommodate a Sephira. Therefore, when the barrier opened, the demon of knowledge had not actually been born. After all, an additional ordinary outer deity would not have much impact on the battle. After the war ended, the original Beander who had assimilated with the knowledge more consumed the Beander characteristic and began to advance up the hermit pathway. Stiano had no objection to this. He even stated that he was willing to hand over the uniqueness and Beander characteristic at the appropriate time, lowering his own status. When he said this, Alice was present. So, at the end of this conversation, as she was about to leave, Alice asked a question that baffled everyone. "Did you also hear the guidance of fate?" Stiano did not answer, and she did not wait for Stiano's answer. Bernadette was no longer the person Alice could coax into calling her Auntie. After her father returned, she no longer feared Alice. Only Katlia still maintained her initial reverence. They simply naturally addressed her as Miss Fate, then entertained her, and after she hurriedly left, they saw Ouroboros following closely behind, deducing the full picture of what had happened. "Are you looking for Miss Fate?" Bernadette asked. "She just left, and we're not sure where she went." Ouroboros nodded lightly and followed without hesitation. Peeking her head out from behind a pile of complex documents, the former Miss Justice, now the Aurora Order's Pope, Audrey, stretched lazily, then looked at the golden retriever sitting upright beside her with a resentful expression, sighing. "Susie, oh Susie, why aren't you a person? That way, you could help me with official business, instead of being like this." Saying she's just a dog. Alice emerged from the air, joining the conversation. "Miss Fate." Audrey looked at Alice in surprise, her expression stunned. "You are. Can't I come to play for no reason?" Alice retorted, casually pulling out a chair to sit down and waving for the golden retriever to come closer to her. Audrey looked at the two of them, wanting to speak but hesitating. Alice seemed to realize her oversight. She turned her head and said with a smile, "Why aren't you continuing to handle your official business, Miss Justice?" Audrey silently sat back down. After becoming God Almighty, Grisha Adam retained the name and some doctrines of the Aurora Order. The profound truth that all things possess divinity was hidden within ordinary doctrines and propagated to every common person. Audrey should not have paid attention to this until she discovered that the Aurora Order was doing the same thing as her, only more thoroughly and fundamentally. This church actually focused its attention entirely on commoners. This was an incredibly surprising matter. Although the faith of commoners and nobles was not inherently superior or inferior, Audrey, having experienced war, knew very well that churches would always prioritize nobles because nobles brought more benefits to the church. But the Aurora Order took a different path. They still collected money from nobles, but Audrey discovered that although the Sun Pathway's notarization ability gave the Aurora Order powerful wealth-gathering capabilities, the church was not wealthy. Aside from building and maintaining the church, they invested more money into the commoner market. Of course, they didn't directly distribute food, they only distributed grain seeds, established schools, and created job opportunities for these purposes. The Fool Church and the Church of Light quickly began to adopt this system. The Fool Church started a global travel business, handled by Beyonders of the Door Pathway. As for the Church of Light, no one knew why so many kind-hearted people donated to the Church of Light. Audrey therefore went to understand the Aurora Order's doctrines. She found that the phrase, "all things possess divinity," indeed contained a deeper meaning. All things possess divinity, and all things are noble only because of more divinity. What is divinity? Audrey knew the answer because the Aurora Order's doctrine stated very clearly that every person is a part of the original creator, and thus all things possess divinity. Undoubtedly, the closer one is to the original, the more divinity one will possess. As for how to approach the original, she, already an angel at that time, knew perfectly well, it was through advancement. In other words, the Aurora Order's classification of people was based solely on their sequence level, without reference to birth or other standards. Alice and Klein both noticed her exploration of the Aurora Order's doctrines. During a casual chat, Alice mentioned Audrey to Klein, asking him, "She looks so confused. Do you want to send her to stay at the Aurora Order for a while and let Grisha teach her, the guiding ideology?" And then, Audrey became a part of the Aurora Order. Her faith in the Fool remained, but she also genuinely loved such doctrines and wanted to strive for a change in the status of commoners. Coupled with the living example of Ouroboros before her eyes, she, who had been actively sent by the Fool, one day made a request to the Fool. She hoped to remain in the Aurora Order for a longer time. Klein had no objections. If he had, he wouldn't have actively sent her there. Thus, Audrey officially joined the Aurora Order, becoming an angel under Grisha Adam, and later becoming the Pope. She is currently carrying out reforms under Grisha Adam's guidance, aiming to change the current aristocratic system and achieve a so-called Great Harmony society. Whether it was realistic or not, Alice only knew that Grisha Adam seemed to really like this student, who originally belonged to the aristocratic class. After petting Susie for a while, Alice bid farewell to Audrey. Audrey hastily stood up and bowed. Once Alice's figure disappeared, she looked at Susie and asked nervously, "Did she do or say anything to you?" Miss Fate no longer planned to feed Susie chocolate, but that didn't stop Miss Fate from having more novel ideas. For example, at that moment, Susie replied, she said, "If the goddess could also lie on her lap like me and let her pet her, that would be great." Audrey's expression became distorted. Audrey knew all too well who this goddess referred to. It was undoubtedly the former Evernight goddess, now the goddess of the river Styx. After accommodating the river of eternal darkness and advancing to outer deity, the name Evernight goddess was clearly no longer suitable. Regarding changing her honorific name, she had originally considered whether to directly call herself Eternal Darkness or Goddess of Eternal Darkness. After the oracle was delivered, a new holy book began to be written, but before it was even issued, Alice read it a step ahead and offered her own comments. "It sounds so awful. This name sounds too inauspicious. Who would believe in that? I thought it was even more absurd for a god to call himself a fool, but this, Eternal Darkness. If I were a believer, hearing this, I would rather believe in the mother of all things." Before the people of the Night Church could comment on this, Alice entered the realm of eternal darkness. That goddess descended from her throne, her smile gentle, her voice soft. "Then what do you think I should be called?" Alice gulped in surprise. She could feel the low pressure emanating from the illusory figure and knew that if she couldn't come up with a good reason today, she would probably have to sleep in this river of eternal darkness for a while. So, she racked her brains and spoke quickly. "Let me think. Darkness, death, twilight. This is actually a process, right? River of eternal darkness. I remember you're Western. I'm not sure which country you're from, but you should have legends about the river Styx, right? How about you call yourself the goddess of the river Styx?" She looked at the illusory figure with anticipation and pleading. The goddess smiled softly, and the dream shattered abruptly, returning her to reality. Then, Alice ran away at the fastest possible speed. However, Alice had indeed never given up the idea of petting wolf fur. This seemed to have become part of her obsession. Therefore, she would occasionally seek out Audrey, then pet Susie to satisfy her craving. Similar sentiments were not the first Susie had heard. She only asked a curious question. "Audrey, since she wants to pet the goddess of the river Styx's fur so much, why doesn't she ask her herself?" Audrey gave a polite smile and asked Susie, "Do you think she hasn't asked?" This statement stunned Susie. She looked at Audrey in surprise, her tone hesitant. Is this luck? Having experienced that war against the outer deities and already being an angel herself, Susie, of course, understood the situation of the goddess of light and knew about the key of light's miraculous passive ability, a long-lasting friendly luck buff. But Susie also knew even more clearly that the goddess of light's combat ability could be described as subtle. She seemed keen on solving all problems with restart and fate cycle. Furthermore, the main reason she was valued was that the words she unintentionally spoke often came true or held deeper meaning. Except for petting wolf fur. Of course, putting aside this exception, most people still like to treat her words as some kind of revelation, trying to analyze the deeper meaning in her words, just like interpreting every revelation of fate. Some fanatical believers would even enthusiastically study her every word, eventually forcing this goddess of light to privately complain to people. "It's truly insane. I think I should just change my name to Lu Xuan." Although Audrey was not clear about what Lu Xuan actually meant. Audrey shook her head, sighed, and was about to talk about the wolf fur incident, when suddenly, another silver figure appeared. She hurriedly looked over, and before she could bow, the figure looked around and asked calmly, "Has she left already?" Hosh, was self-evident. Audrey nodded, and Ouroboros was about to leave. Audrey subconsciously called out, "Wait, Your Eminence Ouroboros, is Miss Fate avoiding you? She might prefer others to call her Your Eminence Saintess." Ouroboros nodded and corrected, "Oh, I know, but You know, I have to do something to remind myself of my faith in Mr. Fool, just like your ever-present crucifix. Audrey rubbed her temples and replied, since you've found your way here, why don't you pray to those two and ask for their help? If you have something urgent. Ouroboros shook his head and replied, this is a game. Your Eminence Saintess would not be pleased if I broke the rules of the game. If there were truly urgent matters to handle, I would ask your Eminence Saintess to temporarily stop the game. Audrey watched in astonishment as Ouroboros disappeared before her. Audrey. Susie called out when she saw her in a daze. What were you trying to tell me just now? Audrey then came back to her senses. She exhaled and turned her head, saying, Miss Fate told me about this before. After that war ended, Miss Fate once suggested to the gods that they hold a celebratory banquet. The gods thought this was a good idea, and those in a relatively stable state chose to attend. At that banquet, Miss Fate asked Mr. Fool, Miracle Invoker, can fulfill many wishes, so can Mr. Fool, who has already become the Lord of the Mysteries, fulfill one of her long-held wishes. Mr. Fool asked what that wish was, and she said she wanted to. Audrey paused, then added, the goddess of the river Styx was right beside them at the time. Chapter 707 Chapter 99 16 Years Part 4. Despite her lingering thoughts about the Evernight goddess's wolf fur, Alice had no intention of seeking out the Evernight goddess. The Evernight goddess might not do anything to her, but with the river of eternal darkness in her hands, the Evernight goddess could truly incapacitate her and hand her over to Ouroboros. If that happened, the game would be forced to end. As she passed by a travel agency displaying the Fool's holy symbol, Alice recalled the proposal of hers that Klein had rejected. Opening a travel agency was her idea, but it wasn't her initial idea. Initially, she had actually suggested that Klein open a millet shop to sell his own merchandise. Selling the image of a deity itself was not advisable, but Klein had so many aliases, Gehrman Sparrow, the 5 Seas Wild Rose from the magician Furz's pen, and his love stories with several female pirates on the high seas, had a huge readership. Alice once suggested that Miss Magician include male pirates as well, or if that wasn't acceptable, to gender bend the male pirates. Furz was dumbfounded upon hearing this, then immediately reported the matter to the Fool, and Alice was subsequently brought back. After the war with the outer deities ended, the people of the West Continent had more interactions with the outside world, and many ideas and knowledge from the West Continent also spread here. Furz found inspiration and several times wanted to create stories based on these, but she never started writing. Then, Alice pulled Furz aside and recounted the cultivation novels she had once read, then asked Furz if she could write books with similar settings. Furz wanted to refuse, but Alice's gaze was too threatening, and she eventually succumbed, beginning to write cultivation novels in this new post-war world. With a deity who controlled luck as a reader, Furz had absolutely no courage to delay her manuscripts, because the deity's way of urging her was to make her unlucky, and still unlucky. And the Fool generally didn't interfere with such jokes. Judgment Zio witnessed the entire process of her friend becoming diligent, and for the first time, she was so glad that she couldn't write novels. Ever since Furz began writing cultivation novels, Alice would often sneak into the Church of Light's monasteries, telling the children inside stories she had read in the past. The start of this hide-and-seek, and the question about mother-child river water, asked by that child, were precisely what Alice had mentioned in her past stories. The reason she didn't tell the stories written by Furz was that the famous Ms. Wall was a loyal romance writer. Even with a cultivation blueprint, she couldn't escape love stories. Alice had no intention of polluting these children's ears with those cliché love stories. At most, she would mention some half-true, half-false rumors, such as the Master of Saphira Castle and the Lord of the Astral World, ahem. But the convoluted love stories in Furz's tales were not something Alice would tell these children. These stories, she gave them to the Key of Light harmonizers from the West Continent. Her wild guesses back then were, in a sense, correct. The Key of Light harmonizers from the West Continent formed what Alice remembered as Buddhism. When she learned of this, Alice only felt it was absurd. The red dot she placed on the brow when creating the face was from a Guanyin statue. Oh no, I really became Guanyin. But Alice had no interest in becoming a monk. Thinking of the Buddhism in her memory, Alice felt fear. As the harmonizers from the West Continent gradually began to integrate into the Church of Light, Alice dedicated herself to making them learn to enjoy life. Then, some of the harmonizers, who still didn't know the truth about the saintess, advised her not to care too much about worldly matters and to put the Evernight goddess first. Alice found it difficult to describe her feelings at the time. She couldn't directly tell some people that she was actually the Evernight goddess herself. Even those who knew about the existence of Restart didn't all know her specific situation. After all, the overt use of Restart was merely to reset status. This usage was not really a secret. Those who ascended to High Sequence or Archangel would more or less hear some inside information. The archangels within the Church of Light all knew, and many archbishops also knew the situation. For one, those from the Life School of Thought were generally aware that their Fate speaker had this move. But Alice couldn't possibly take a loudspeaker and shout it on the street, or bang on the table then and there to say she was actually the Evernight goddess. With her unpretentious style of acting within the church, most people would probably think she was talking nonsense if they heard her. Thinking of this possibility, Alice sighed deeply, her eyes darted around, and she had an idea for her next target. Her figure flickered, and a church appeared before her eyes. This church had a spire. At Alice's request, the church was not of a common architectural type. The walls were curved, and the exterior design largely used curves rather than straight lines, while the colors were very vibrant. The Church of Light was not initially built in this form. Similar churches were mostly the work after the God Wars. The one currently before her was one of the newly built churches. The one presiding over this church was Roy King, who came from the Life School of Thought back then. Roy King had not advanced since reaching Sequence 4. It wasn't that he lacked Beander characteristic, nor was it entirely a ritual issue. Rather, Alice naturally had no good impression of such a fence-sitter. Although she seemed to waver, Alice could honestly say that her stance with Klein had always been firm. Even if the thought of having Eamon become the Lord of the Mysteries had arisen, her original intention was still for Klein's sake. So, when she discriminated against Roy King, she felt no guilt. Alice gracefully entered the church, smiling and nodding to everyone who greeted her. This was Klein's request. He hoped Alice would at least appear decent in front of ordinary people. Alice accepted. After all, they were her believers, and it would be too awkward if she scared them away. Moreover, Alice was in a good mood today, and she was happy to put on a show. So she walked all the way into the basement with a smile, asked the on-duty staff, then went to the door of the Archbishop's office and knocked. "Please come in," a steady voice came from within. Alice gently twisted the doorknob, pushed the door open, and entered. Roy King was not handling documents but was holding a book. This was normal. Alice was not surprised. Unlike other churches, incidents rarely occurred within the jurisdiction of the Church of Light, and even if they did, they were mostly in the territories of other churches. As for the reason, Alice personally decided that the lucky ones would be the captains of the Lightseekers, the winners would be responsible for leading the seers, and the Calamity Priests would be responsible for recruiting believers externally, especially remembering not to recruit within the church's jurisdiction. The gods initially didn't realize what was so special about this, but when every church was busy with duties, and the Church of Light rarely had incidents, and almost all of them were external assignments, the heads of the various dioceses realized that these Calamity Priests truly lived up to their name. But it was irrational to bother the gods for such a small matter, and the Lightseekers, divination and anti-divination, as well as their perception of fate, were truly useful. Moreover, the Calamity Priests also seemed to be aware of their own characteristics. Whenever they foresaw a disaster outside, they would contact the local church immediately. Thus, the major churches gradually acquiesced to this. The compromise made by the Church of Light was to deploy the seer teams for external assignments. Although winners and lucky ones were mostly not good at direct combat, having one in the team was really useful. Of course, the Fool Church and the Aurora Order both had no objections, and both had the intention of protecting the Church of Light, which was the most important reason. Of course, they could only rely on protection, because the Church of Light was the only church that did not house sealed artifacts. Except for items corresponding to their own pathway, all other items would be handed over to one of these two churches nearby. There were rumors that their true god was unwilling to manage them. As ordinary church members, most people dared not comment on this. They simply believed that what the people of the Church of Light said was true. But to say that the Church of Light had no sealed artifacts to use would also be incorrect. Their churches beyonders could always consult the inventory of sealed artifacts from these two churches and borrow them, with usage permissions no different from the internal members of these two churches. This seemed to be an agreement set by the divine hierarchy. If you had read their holy book, you would find this normal. After all, a mother's love for her children is a common thing. In comparison, the goddess of the river Styx, who also recorded the Evernight goddess as a child, seemed much stricter. She seemed to be the only strict mother among these three mothers. For Alice, this was also true. Not every deity agreed to Alice's absurd request to write Alice in their holy book and give her the identity of a divine child. For example, Medici did not agree. His original words were, "I would rather write Amen as my divine child in the holy book, because he truly is." Then, Alice relayed this matter to Grisha, Adam and Amen. As for how it was handled afterwards, Alice was not clear. Earth Mother Lilith had no objection to this, but Alice didn't have the courage to be a divine child to her. Although the mother goddess of depravity had been forced away and the mother nest sealed, this Evernight goddess's condition was truly not good. Alice was very worried that one day, she would truly become the mother of all things. The god of steam and machinery also had no objections, but Alice felt that if it were to be written, it should at least wait until the demon of knowledge was born, and let the demon of knowledge write it. At present, the demon of knowledge had not yet been born. As for Rosal Gustav, the current master of the nation of disorder, Alice didn't even mention this matter. This great emperor wouldn't mind acknowledging her as his niece, but a divine child. Alice estimated that he would probably recall the taste of an iron-blooded knight as really good, which he had finally managed to forget. As for the remaining Sephira, the tenebrous world, before the war with the outer deities began, an outer deity had indeed been born here in a sense. It was actually controlled jointly by the devil King Farbati and the Sephira harmonizers from the West Continent. Grisha Adam originally hadn't intended to foster an outer deity in this way, as their combat power was already sufficient, but the two of them were remarkably consistent in their lack of strong will to survive, reaching a consensus to become a bomb after the barrier opened, which could also be considered a way of expending their remaining energy. Currently, no new outer deity had been born in the tenebrous world. However, even if there were, Alice felt that she should also put a question mark on the tenebrous world. After all, unlike the Son of Chaos or the Uncertain Mist, who were still acting as lamp genies, the Mother Tree of Desire was also living well. The only ones who truly agreed to Alice's request were actually Grisha Adam, Klein, and the current goddess of the river Styx. Klein was still mostly indulgent towards Alice. Alice would not touch Klein's bottom line, and Klein would not restrict her too much. Grisha Adam, however, would occasionally rein her in, mainly to prevent her from playing with Amen. This the creator was clearly well aware of his child's nature and did not want the two of them to be together. Alice had no objections. Amen, whose power was only that of an archangel, had truly become a toy rather than a playmate. Although he was exceptionally fun among toys, he was ultimately just a toy. Alice didn't mind switching to another, and Amen, who bullied the weak and feared the strong, clearly wasn't very keen on playing with someone stronger than himself. Ultimately, it was just that everyone else was too boring. The current goddess of the river Styx, formerly the Evernight goddess, was instead the most difficult to negotiate with. She seemed to avoid being too close to Alice as much as possible, especially after Alice asked her about the wolf fur in her presence. She became even more distant from Alice. Alice was very displeased about this, because Klein, who was also pestered by her, chose another method. He generously displayed his mythical creature form, letting Alice squeeze a few slippery tentacles, then told Alice that she could ask Amen if he had any. Then, Amen went to Grisha Adam to complain. Alice collected her thoughts. Roy King had not noticed her arrival. She tiptoed closer, then smoothly flipped over the table, pulled the book he was reading from Roy King's hand, and looked at the title. The Immortal Venerable is very devoted. She read the beginning, and Roy King had already stood up, bowing and saluting. Your Holiness, the Saintess. Alice silently tossed the book back to him. Just from half a sentence, she knew what it was. This was clearly a casual romance novel written by Furs. As for the title, such a talented name, of course, she came up with it. In fact, Furs had already learned Alice's naming style and was still experimenting, just not skilled enough. According to Furs, after changing her naming style, her books indeed became more popular. Alice remained silent about this. She cleared her throat twice, looked at Roy King, and immediately accused him. How can you sit here reading novels during work hours? You wage thief. ... Roy King opened his mouth, wanting to retort, but for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Their saintess, who was also the deity herself, clearly didn't think his behavior was problematic, she was just casually looking for an opening line. Chapter 708 Chapter 116 Years 5. Alice was clearly waiting for a response with great interest. Roy King didn't dare to delay too long. He quickly thought and replied, Ms. Wall once revealed in an interview that her latest naming technique was guided by you. Therefore, whenever she writes book titles in a similar style, I will read the content to feel your teachings. Alice shivered. She had seen that interview, but clearly didn't take it seriously. After all, she had long since escaped the limitations of lifespan, and was living in human form now, which was more for fun. One day, when she got tired of it, the saintess of the Church of Light would return to the goddess's divine kingdom. But Roy King was clearly lying, which was fine, but he also chose such a disgusting reason. Alice quickly raised her hand to stop him from speaking further, and said, If I didn't know you, I would almost really think you were a devout believer. Roy King stopped abruptly. A few seconds later, he said frankly, I follow the guidance of fate, and you are the embodiment of fate. Since that's the case, how can I not be your devout follower? Could it be that you mind me actively betraying the life school of thought? Your Holiness, your Pope also comes from the Aurora Order, and was once the angel of destiny under the Creator. Alice couldn't help but laugh, interrupting, he is still the Creator's angel of destiny. Quote. Roy King was stunned. He looked up, his eyes full of questions. Alice, tisk, Ed before explaining, even if he left the Aurora Order, he still insists on praying to his old master every day, and carries with him the holy object bestowed by his old master before he left. Perhaps you've seen it. He has a cross pendant, and on that pendant, there is a trace of the Creator's spirit. Quote. Roy King's expression was extremely astonished. He looked at Alice in surprise, his eyes full of doubt. Since that's the case, why do you still keep him? And you and His Holiness the Pope seem to have a very good relationship. Alice's ambiguous gaze swept over Roy King. His mention of Ouroboros indeed reminded Alice of some things. Alice suddenly couldn't help but say, I admire his steadfastness, and, as you said, he devoutly follows the footsteps of fate, at least for now, I am the embodiment of fate. But then again, Roy King, what do you think steadfastness is? Her tone suddenly became formal. Roy King was stunned for a moment, then tentatively said, I think for you, it should be unchanging. Yes, Alice sighed, but you say, can being steadfastly a fence-sitter be considered steadfast? Roy King was stunned, but Alice didn't care. She sighed as if to herself. The dragon of wisdom, Harabergen, betrayed his old master, the dragon of imagination Anquelt, and joined the newly rising the Creator, becoming the wisdom angel among the 8 king of angels. Later, he betrayed the Creator again, benefiting from the Creator's death and becoming a true god. However, when the Creator returned, he actively handed over his Beander characteristic and uniqueness, claiming that he was only keeping them on his behalf. At that time, the choices of Storm and Pure White made him extremely flustered, and he had no choice but to pretend to obey and make such a choice. Now that the Lord has returned, he should return what belongs to him. And now, he has returned to the Creator's side, becoming the wisdom angel, but no longer a king of angels, not even an archangel. I think if there are changes in the future, he probably won't stand by the Creator's side either. You say, can such a steadfast traitor really be considered steadfast? Roy King had already begun to ponder when Alice spoke. Now, being questioned by Alice, he was not flustered at all, only asking, why did he do that? Alice glanced at him and replied, he said he just wanted to live. So, Roy King nodded without hesitation, in that case, I think it counts. He has never betrayed his own heart, living is his constant pursuit. All the manifestations you see are choices he made for the sole goal of living. Doesn't this prove his steadfastness? Alice nodded thoughtfully. She looked at Roy King and suddenly smiled. You can prepare for the Sequence 3 advancement ritual. You should know the potion formula, right? Roy King was slightly startled, a fervent joy appearing on his face, and he immediately bowed, "Praise be to you, great goddess of light." Alice didn't correct him, she just turned and left, saying lightly, "Praise what? I'm not planning to make you an angel. My first angel cannot be someone like you, he must be a true lightseeker." This was Alice's long-held plan. Recruiting Eamon was for entertainment, and at this moment, she didn't need to fear Eamon. If Eamon really intended to do something, Eamon could go home and complain, and she certainly could too. And setting aside external influences like calling parents, if she and Eamon went 1v1, she would definitely win. The Beander characteristic of the redemption angel was actually a gesture of goodwill towards Grisha Adam. When the circle of inevitability intended to descend its angel, Grisha Adam did not interfere, which showed his attitude. Therefore, after the war ended, Alice shared a portion of the spoils with Eamon, making up for Amon's losses back then. The idea of recruiting Eamon as her angel was born after making this decision, as the fact that the redemption angel is the embodiment of deceit and mischief really fit Alice's consistent aesthetic. But that was as far as it went. The remaining Beander characteristic of the redemption angel was intended by Alice for the first angel entirely cultivated by the Church. After the Church was established, the Church of Light, like other churches, also set up monasteries specifically for orphans. Here were pitiful children deliberately placed outside the monastery, those who became orphans due to great changes, and those brought back by the Church's Beyonders from their travels. They studied and grew up within the Church, receiving the Church's education from a young age, which of course included ideological education. And what Alice wanted was an angel who grew up under such cultivation. Then, she could consider letting Ouroboros retire. Regarding this, Alice was actually still hesitating. After all, an angel's lifespan is limited. If Ouroboros died as the Pope of the Church of Light, the Beander characteristic he left behind should rightfully belong to the Church of Light. Alice believed Grisha Adam wouldn't want it, and of course, she didn't plan to send it back. At most, she would return Ouroboros' related items. But if Ouroboros retired, he might not stay. If he returned to the Aurora Order, Alice felt that it would be too unsightly for her to go and demand his body parts then. If the target was the former Will Osepton, now Will Smith, Alice would not hesitate. As the child of Dunn and Ms. Daly, Will Smith was in the Night Church, now renamed the Church of the Goddess of the River Styx. He grew up in the monastery of the Church of the Goddess of the River Styx. Daly and Dunn would visit their child after work, but Will Smith seemed to have received some hint. He was not particularly close to this pair of parents, only showing his fervent faith in the then Evernight goddess. Aside from that, Will Smith grew up like an ordinary child, with nothing special about him, even diligently attending classes. Alice was no less so. Some of Klein's words were actually serious, he really hired a tutor for Alice. Even later, as the saintess of the Church of Light, the only change it brought was a few more classes. Yes, the great goddess of light, after becoming her own saintess, was forced to study her own doctrines, study her own holy book. And that wasn't all. After finishing the Church's courses, Her Holiness the Saintess would return home and still have to attend the tutor's classes, studying painting, music, etiquette, literature, philosophy, equestrianism, and many other subjects. Now, 16-year-old Alice had fully realized that no matter the era, learning was never an easy task. To avoid the tutor, Alice spent most of her time in the church. Later, because the male and female servants of Mage Manor were almost figuring out her pattern, Alice also began to run to other churches, trying to avoid those who came looking for her. But such things couldn't be done too excessively. Klein seemed determined to really make her attend classes, and even in turn advised her to seriously play her role. Alice was very speechless about this. She argued with Klein a few times to no avail, and was forced to accept it, but she would run away after a few days of study, just to add extra holidays for herself. In comparison, Will Smith's life was indeed much easier. The resentful Alice had actually sought trouble with Will many times. She suddenly felt that this, fate speaker, of the life school of thought had too deep a karmic bond with her. From being deceived when she was young and naive, to being forced later, Alice unilaterally formed a mortal enmity with Will Smith. After the godhood ritual ended, finding that Will had become the child of Captain Dunn and Ms. Daly, Alice felt new hatred added to old, but she was hesitant, not daring to act. She was unsure of Captain and Ms. Daly's reaction if they knew the truth, and unsure if they would choose to protect their child. And if nothing was said, their child dying for no reason would inevitably make them incredibly sad. Alice chose to evade. She said her condition wasn't good, said she felt Will Smith's time of death hadn't arrived, said at worst she'd let him live to a ripe old age. Ultimately, it was all evasion. After finding countless excuses for herself, Alice naturally ignored the matter. Later, as the apocalypse approached, Alice was no longer in the mood to think about it. So Will Ossepton Smith grew up safely like this, living until the eve of the apocalypse, participating in the apocalyptic war as an angel-level combatant. So Alice thought again, maybe Will would die in the war. Then she wouldn't have to do it herself. Everything ended as she expected, but when the war ended and she saw Will still alive, Alice truly felt that Will might indeed not be destined to die. This almost absurd good luck protected Will Smith one last time. Alice ultimately did not act against him. She truly, as she said, decided to give Will a chance to live to a ripe old age. She no longer interfered with Will Smith's affairs. After negotiations with the same night goddess, now renamed the goddess of the river Styx, Will Smith left the night church, bid farewell to his parents, and went out to study. He lived and studied like an ordinary person. Alice allowed him to continue living like this, unable to establish power, nor contact any old acquaintances to seek help. As for imprisonment and surveillance, as long as he remained on the fate pathway, and as long as he remained an angel of the fate pathway, he would live his entire life under Alice's gaze. Oh, no, actually he didn't live too ordinary a life, because although Alice didn't kill him, she left him with perpetual misfortune. He would forever be impoverished, penniless, and would forever sleep on the streets. In this new world where crop seeds had been optimized by the Beyonders of the Earth Mother Church, in this new world where the new God Almighty was diligently reforming, he was the only vagrant who couldn't afford food or a home. Moreover, he would occasionally become extraordinarily unlucky because the top-tier deities were in a bad mood. For an angel, similar things actually had limited impact. After all, eating was just a personal hobby, and sleeping on the street was just uncomfortable. But Will Smith knew exactly why his luck had turned out this way. To please the deity who had cast down misfortune, he often stood in front of ice cream stalls, looking longing to taste his favorite ice cream again. Will even worked as an assistant in an ice cream shop, asking for no wages, only to be able to taste a bite of ice cream. The boss was greatly surprised and gladly accepted. Then, he watched as this assistant, every time he picked up ice cream, would fail to eat it for various reasons, such as the ice cream slipping or dirty things touching it. After repeating this several times, he finally understood why his assistant had made such a request. Chapter 709 Chapter 101 16 Years End. Year 16 End. Watching Alice walk out the door, Roy King sat back down. He knew that leaving through the door was the goddess's peculiar sense of ritual. In reality, the moment she stepped out, she was no longer in the real world. But as soon as his butt touched the seat, Roy King stood up in surprise. He bowed respectfully and said, "Pope." The figure of the silver-haired man appeared before him, his gaze sweeping around. He didn't respond but directly said, "Has she left already?" "Just left," Roy King replied. Ouroboros nodded and disappeared without hesitation. Roy King waited a moment before straightening up. He looked around, confirmed that no one else was coming to look for him, and then sat down, picking up the novel. Alice found Melissa Moretti in a church belonging to the Fool Church. She had black hair and brown eyes, a delicate appearance, and wore dark pants and a skirt. When Alice sat beside her, she instinctively turned to look, then her eyes widened, and she was about to scream. Alice quickly leaned in and covered her mouth, warning, "Quiet down." I snuck out. Seeing Melissa nod, Alice released her, withdrew her hand, and sat back, smiling sweetly. "Long time no see. Your Eminence," Melissa looked at her with complex eyes, "you skipped class again." Alice blinked innocently twice and smiled, "It's not my fault. How can they expect an angel to listen to class obediently?" She and Melissa knew each other. When Miss Alice Moretti appeared before people as the Saintess of the Church of Light, Melissa and her brother Benson noticed her surname. Their first reaction was to inquire about the Saintess's background. The newly established Church of Light didn't have many members, but its management wasn't lax. Moreover, most members weren't clear about what Moretti represented, so everyone was clueless when asked. Melissa only found out that the other party lived in Mage Manor. Melissa nervously found the manor, and just a distant glance made her feel that it wasn't a place she should be. She was about to leave when she saw a little girl climb over the wall, then her figure swayed as if she was about to fall, and there was no one else around. Melissa rushed over without thinking, but the girl steadied herself, then flashed, appearing face to face before her, then extended her tender little hand, covering Melissa's scream that almost escaped. "Quiet down," she said, "I'm skipping class, miss." "Oh, wait, you look familiar, no, you are." As if she had discovered something, she cupped Melissa's face and scrutinized it. Melissa was too scared to speak. At that time, she was already a Sequence 7 appraiser, but having spent years in the laboratory, she hadn't actually seen many true Beander events. The floating girl terrified her, making her scalp tingle with dread. Alice noticed her state, withdrew her hand, and first comforted her. "You don't have to be afraid. You are, your client's sister, right? I remember your name should be Melissa, correct?" This statement, like a self-exposure of identity, was like a thunderclap. Melissa's eyes suddenly widened as she looked at the girl. She had now landed on the ground, her not-so-tall stature and tender face, coupled with her silver hair and the red mole between her eyebrows, confirmed her identity to Melissa. She blurted out, "You are the saintess of the Church of Light." "That's right," Alice nodded with a smile. Melissa quickly relaxed. The identity of a righteous church gave her trust, so she quickly remembered Alice's question, her purpose, and couldn't help but ask. "You know Klein?" Alice just quietly looked at Melissa at the time, then chuckled. "My surname is Moretti." This was a pointless remark, but Melissa took it as confirmation. She immediately followed up with, "He's still alive, isn't he?" Alice recalled Klein's attitude. At that time, Klein, who had already become a god, no longer cared about revealing the truth to his former relatives, so Alice nodded easily. Melissa seemed to relax completely. She didn't continue to ask and was about to turn and leave. Alice quickly called out, "Aren't you going to ask about his current situation?" Melissa stopped. She looked at Alice and asked her a question. "Is that something I should know?" In the time after becoming a Beander, she had already learned about the existence of secrecy levels. Alice smiled and replied, "From an identity standpoint, no. But if he wants you to know, then no one can object. Just like me, if I wanted to keep it a secret, I shouldn't have said my surname was Moretti from the beginning. This surname itself is a hint." And, her gaze fell on Melissa, and she thoughtfully asked, "You seem to have already sensed something." Melissa was silent for a moment before replying, Do you and Klein have a blood relationship?" Alice hummed, organizing her words. How do I explain it to you? We don't have a blood relationship in the mortal's sense. Our connection comes from mysticism, from fate. In terms of fate, we are mother and daughter. If you can't quite accept that, you can also think of us as father and daughter, which might align more with your past understanding. So, after hearing these words, Melissa made a logical guess. He is now. She raised her hand and drew a scale symbol on her chest. Alice fell into a brief silence. She sat on the ground, rolling around with laughter, clutching her stomach. Melissa stood rooted, neither advancing nor retreating. After a long while, she cautiously called out, Your Eminence. Alice instantly stopped laughing and sat up. Not a speck of dust clung to her, but Melissa didn't find it strange. Having entered the Beander world, she naturally understood the hierarchy of Beanders. In her opinion, the saintess of the Church of Light was probably an angel of the Goddess of Light. Goddess, mother and daughter. Thinking of a certain possibility, Melissa's expression became somewhat grim. Alice raised her hand and gestured. "Can you squat down and talk to me? Always looking up like this isn't good for a child's physical development." Melissa obediently squatted down. Alice, having temporarily stopped laughing, got up from the ground and told Melissa, "I need to relay this to Klein. However, you can't go back with this understanding, or he won't let me off." How about this? I can give you a hint. Have you read the Holy Book of the Church of Light? Melissa nodded without hesitation. Alice smiled and hinted, "You guessed one thing right, he has indeed become a being of that level." However, Miss Melissa, you should broaden your perspective. In my Lord's holy book, he has 3 mothers. Can you guess which one is your brother? Melissa's pupils suddenly contracted. Her mind was not on the saintess of light before her, so she didn't associate this with the saintess's identity. She only recalled the relevant records in the light's holy book. The Creator is his first mother. In the eternal darkness and chaos, the Creator declared to this world, "Let there be light." The first ray of light in the world was thus born. It illuminated the world, bringing light and hope to life. The goddess of the river Styx is his second mother. The obsessions of the departed soul surged into a whirlpool in the depths of the river Styx. Those unfulfilled wishes transformed into silver fish chasing light, swimming upstream. The veil of the goddess of the river Styx caressed the most persistent wandering spirits, giving them the power to ascend. The fool is his third mother. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog watched this life leap out of the river Styx. He carried misfortune from the river Styx. Without the guidance of luck, he would be struck down again by the surging waves of the river Styx. Thus, the fool bestowed luck upon him, and he finally grasped that original light, becoming one with light. The Creator, goddess of the river Styx. The fool. 3 deities flashed through Melissa's mind. She almost immediately found the answer, staring at Alice without moving. The Creator is the god worshipped by the Aurora Order. He has existed for a long time. The goddess of the river Styx is actually the former Evernight goddess. Our family members are all followers of the Evernight goddess. Only the fool. I had never heard of this deity before. But the fool who does not belong to this era, Alice smiled. Don't worry, I assure you, he is your brother, not the other possibility you thought of. Melissa wanted to say something else, but Alice suddenly looked back and said, "If I don't run now, I'll probably be found very soon. Melissa, if you have more questions, go ask him yourself, my responsibility ends here." You're already a Beander, so I don't need to teach you about Beander rituals, right? This was Alice and Melissa's first meeting. What Klein's plan required careful deliberation was completely settled by Alice in one meeting. As for what followed, that was between Klein and Melissa. Alice hardly ever sought out Melissa afterward, but Melissa would occasionally come to Alice, wanting to inquire about Klein's experiences. Now, seeing Melissa, Alice thought she was going to ask about Klein again. She watched Melissa quickly disregard the topic of skipping class and organize her words, but then heard an unexpected question. "Your Eminence, do you know the rituals for other pathways to advance to Sequence 4? Alice paused. "I know, what's wrong? Are they all so?" Melissa frowned, hesitating. "Are they all so evil?" Alice was stunned for a moment, then realized that she was about to advance to Sequence 4. However, the Sequence 4 advancement ritual for the Savant pathway was to extract all life force from a certain area, turning the soil into a desert and drying up lakes. Melissa wouldn't like this ritual. But there were many solutions, so Alice said, "If it's you, there should still be many choices. After all, a ritual is essentially just about stabilizing one's state. Even if we don't consider alternative rituals, there are simple ways, for example, finding a planet without living beings, or for example, you could consider. Have you heard of bestowal?" This was a new thing from the West Continent. Most ordinary Beyonders were unaware of it, and even Melissa, when she had no need, wouldn't have this information brought to her. So she just asked in confusion, "What is that?" Alice shook her head and replied, "Oh, actually, I'm not sure how to explain it to you, because I don't know how to do it either. But I know that by advancing this way, the ritual requirements can be greatly reduced, and perhaps no ritual is even needed. Of course, it's still best to have a ritual, but at that time, the ritual shouldn't be so uncomfortable for you. You can consider it first. After all, you shouldn't be in a hurry, right? If it doesn't work after trying, you can then look for a lifeless planet, which should also be fine. Want to try? How should I attempt it?" Melissa asked again. "I can introduce you to a teacher." Alice raised an eyebrow. "Of course, if you go to the Steam Church or the Full Church, I think they shouldn't refuse you either." Melissa nodded thoughtfully, her expression seemingly in deep thought. Alice silently got up and left. She looked around, then her gaze fixed on a silver-haired figure in the corner. He seemed to have arrived here long ago, just standing there quietly, not actively disturbing her. Alice paused for a moment, then walked over and asked in a low voice. "How did you find me?" The silver-haired angel looked at her, pointed to Melissa, who was sitting in quiet contemplation, and calmly explained. "Your mother conveyed the scene of you interacting with her to me." Damn Klein. Alice gnashed her teeth, then sneered, "Let's go back." The silver-haired angel, Ouroboros, shook his head and followed behind her, gently reminding her. "Your Eminence, your mother also mentioned something else to me." Alice frowned and looked back at him. Ouroboros said, "You are already 16 this year, and you will be an adult in 2 years. Your mother hopes that you can experience a complete mortal's life. She hopes you will go to college." Question mark. Alice gasped, recoiling 2 steps in horror. "You're joking, Ouroboros." Ouroboros shook his head regretfully and replied, "Perhaps you should ask your mother." Quote. Alice bit down, and a few seconds later, she smiled again. Forget it, you're not suitable." Has Eamon ever been to college? Probably not. Ouroboros thought for a moment and replied, "No, I'm not too sure. He might have had a clone attend college." "You say," Alice tilted her head, "if I invite Eamon to go to college with me, would he agree?" I don't know, Ouroboros replied calmly. Post-completion thoughts. So many things were on my mind, but when I actually put pen to paper, I didn't know what to write. I guess I'll just start writing nonsense now. This ending, many people seem to find it a bit sudden. But actually, if the 7th volume of Circle of Destiny hadn't been so bizarre, I probably would have directly skipped to the end of the God Wars after Klein became the Fool, writing a semi-epilogue style ending. To be honest, this way of writing the ending is actually my comfort zone. This kind of jumping, writing whatever comes to mind, casually patching together plotlines from different timelines, this is how they originally existed in my head. I don't have to do anything, I just have to paste them out. If I wrote normally, I'd have to arrange them. Dazed. But no matter what, it's finally coming to an end. I started the book haphazardly, put it on the shelves haphazardly, and then dragged it on for so long, I finally finished it, boo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Extras. Oh, extras. Anyway, writing them continuously now is impossible. They'll probably drop randomly, maybe in the group chat or the comment section. But as for in the book, I remember you can't post extras after changing the status pacing back and forth. Seriously, it's really not easy that this book made it to today. I'm not a very persistent person. Many times, I'll impulsively do all sorts of random things, but if you ask me to stick to something, that's a big problem. So, I impulsively published this book, and then just 2 days after starting it, I thought about deleting it and running away, but people actually read it. And more people read it. Holy crap, it can actually get a contract. Never mind, I'll just keep writing for now. And then, around the time it was about to be put on the shelves, Tono gave me a Alliance Leader reward. I was so excited at the time, I told my friend that I would definitely finish this book, even if it was just for her. Why her? Because I initially thought Tono was a little girl, wiped sweat. For a long time, my motivation to write came from Tono's chapter reviews. It felt like I could only write with peace of mind after seeing her comment, "I don't care, it's her." As for later, the story grew longer and longer, and I could see Alice transform from a name on paper into a living person in my consciousness. It was like I could hear her speak, see her smiling at me, feel her presence. At that time, I started to become reluctant to let go of this story. I thought I should at least write an ending for her, perhaps not a perfect one, but at least there should be a conclusion. But even so, it couldn't stop me from wanting to run away whenever I encountered a setback. I really am a particularly unpersistent person, but it's amazing how my wavering persistence pushed me through the entire journey. Standing at the finish line, I felt the same shock as when I completed a 20-kilometer walk back then. How did I finish it, JPG? Dazed. New book. Actually, I originally wanted to write an original story, but, well, how should I put it? I revised it many times, but I just couldn't write an opening that I was satisfied with. After reluctantly showing one version to my editor, I didn't want to write it anymore, because I was thinking, maybe it's not yet time for this story to appear. Sounds a bit superstitious, looks away, and then, I opened my mysterious folder, pulled out manuscripts I had put down before for similar reasons, and then I decided. I'm going to write an original pathway. After all, high sequence beyonders of the fate pathway are almost like original creations anyway. Dazed. So, the next book will still be a fanfiction of mysteries, but with an original pathway. As for that opening I couldn't write, I don't know, because I can't see the beginning of that story. It's completely different from Alice. With Alice's story, I could only see the beginning, not the continuation. My wording is a bit strange, please try to understand JPG. Flipping through calendar. I originally said I'd check the almanac for a good day, but after looking closely, I realized I didn't know which section to look at. How about this, let me be a bit casual, we'll meet after the Dragon Boat Festival. Coincidentally, that day is also the 3rd, although it's June 3rd. Waving. Wait, no, even though I've finished, you're not allowed to stop giving me monthly votes. At least finish voting for this month. Screaming. Otherwise, I'm going to cry. Boo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo.
For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.